Okay, the day before we start class, just for the fun of it, if you could have one song play every time you're in a room, what would it be? Now, uh, there's a little picture of me throwing a desk over. If you want to know that story, I don't know. You have to ask nicely. I have to figure it out. Boy, but man, I look angry, don't I? Throwing that desk over. That's not good. Okay, put your song in chat. We'll talk about it. I want to know. Now, here's what you need for today. First off, you need to have one. Don't play. Gotta focus. Vocab notes, paper from last week. We'll talk about the vocab notes from last week, and a pencil or pen. That's all. First thing we're looking at. From review from last week's Northwest Passage. Okay, and that's that trail, that water passage between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans up and over the top of North America. Okay, elusive, hard to find, lucrative, making lots of money. We may not have talked about those very much in depth last week, but those are the words we need to know today. Now, also review from last week. The first 3 dates we had were the coastal plateau cultures emerging. Don't forget that little squiggly line showing us the break. 1592, Juan de Fuca claims to have sailed the Pacific coast northwest, and then Captain Cook sailed to the Pacific Northwest. Captain Cook, fascinating. Oh, I didn't tell you this last week, but Captain Cook, if you've ever heard of Mutiny on the Bounty, one of Captain Cook's lieutenants was a guy named Captain Bligh, or Lieutenant Bligh. And Bligh was a very notoriously cruel captain. The Navy back then had a lot of right to punish their sailors, and he was extremely cruel. And so shortly after he left Captain Cook, his are the sailors that mutinied against him and pitched him overboard in a lifeboat. And then they crashed the ship, the Bounty, on the coast of Pitcairn Island. What is amazing about Captain Bligh, he sailed that lifeboat from essentially just north of New Zealand all the way back across the Indian Ocean, all the way up to England. Okay, and so him and the sailors that were with him in that lifeboat, he was an amazing seaman. He could navigate very well, and he brought his people back, which is phenomenal. Then he took more sailors out to go find the mutineers. I have to look that up and see if they ever found them. So your timeline, what are the next dates you're going to have? What do you think they'll be? And why do you think it is that? Write your answer in chat right now. I'll hit pause if you're at home and write a few things down, because just to test yourself, see what you come up with. Now we'll go. Next date, Robert Gray discovers the Columbia River. Robert Gray is pretty amazing. 1792. I already gave you the story about Captain Bligh. I have to look up the date of when the Mutiny on the Bounty was. But sailors in this time frame, again, we talked about scurvy last week. We talked about using longitude and clocks to navigate. Sailing back in this time frame would have been phenomenally difficult. In fact, while soldiers or sailors were still experiencing scurvy, many times these sailors would be overpacked onto a ship because you would count on losing about half your guys over the course of your voyage to disease, to death. And so you'd have almost twice as many people as you needed on the boat to sail on your excursion. Now, another thing that was happening, especially after the American Revolution, American sailors, especially in the Atlantic Ocean, frequently they were being caught out at sea, and they'd be transferred to British ships because there was no proof that they were not British soldiers or sailors. And so the British ships would stop these American boats and say, hey, by the way, you are you left, you mutinied, and we're taking you as a sailor now. And so life at sea would be very difficult. you would never be sure if you were going to return home once you went out to sea. Now, Captain Gray, he sailed down around the Horn of South America. And like I told you last week, that's about an 8-month journey from Boston to about San Francisco ish. And so you would be gone at sea for a very, very long time. Now, in the same time frame, okay, pirates. There were pirates frequenting the coast of the Pacific. Um, Now, there is a difference between pirates and privateers. Typically, a privateer has a contract to be a pirate. Okay. So I might go to a country and say, I will be your pirate and I will keep the loot, but I'll only pirate ships that are our enemy ships. And so frequently, um, privateers would be given a license to be pirates. As long as they only attacked certain ships from certain countries, they'd be granted that freedom. But we have pirates all across the world, not just the Caribbean. Okay, the Caribbean is one spot they'd have pirates, and the reason why the Caribbean is a hot spot is because that is part of what's called the Spanish Main. Spanish ships sailed frequently from Mexico, north the northern coast of South America, across and over to Florida, then up the coast along the Gulf Stream. And so anywhere that is in that Caribbean up through that by South Carolina-ish, these ships with a lot of gold would be targeted by privateers or pirates. And to take down a Spanish ship full of gold, you'd be very, very wealthy. Although, as a privateer, you'd have to turn much of that, well, you'd have to turn some of that loot over to your own people. And we can look at that because colonial times were kind of rough on the colonists. That's why we revolted. But pirates frequented the Pacific coast too, and the Indian Ocean. And so some of those pirates that you see in the Caribbean also sail all the way to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean too, because money is money. And taking down a ship that has a lot of wealth on it is a great way to make easy money. Easy money. I don't think any of this would be very easy. But pirates were out on that coast. Now, in 1792, Robert Gray sailed into the Columbia River. They traded with Native Americans. They got sea otter pelts. That's another way you could establish wealth is through trade. And looking at the wealth of furs in the Northwest was important. And I believe Captain Gray took his ship to China to exchange goods to open up markets there. So 1792, Robert Gray. Next one, 1803, United States buys Louisiana. Thomas Jefferson, the president of the United States at that time, was initially a small government president. He didn't want the government of the Americas to expand at all. But shortly after he got into power, Napoleon contacted the United States and offered to sell us Louisiana. Now, Louisiana at that time went from, it's a territory, and I should tell you about this with Gray too. When you claimed a river, and that's what Robert Gray did when he claimed the Columbia River, you get that drainage basin. So wherever water falls into that river through rain, okay, when you sail into a river, the law of exploration said you've got that whole drainage basin. So the French had the Mississippi River drainage basin, and that goes all the way up to Minnesota and then takes the Missouri all the way out west to almost western Montana, okay, the Continental Divide. And so it's a huge territory. Now, Napoleon, he is the Napoleon with his hand on his chest. He was in major wars in Europe at that time, and one thing he wanted to do is he wanted to establish the continent of Europe as his base, and he wanted to keep the British out. Now, the British had a great navy at this time, and they also had a pretty good army. And so in his quest to solidify his grip on Europe, he needed money. Now, some people believe that he did want to move west and use Louisiana territory as a agricultural basin for his European exploits and for his worldwide empire, but he didn't have the resources to go that far. And so he determined to sell it to the United States. Now, Thomas Jefferson, initially, his philosophy was, no, we can't spend money, we can't expand, we can't do these things. But once Napoleon came to him and said, we'll give it to you for this much money, I think it was $15 million, Thomas Jefferson went, that's a great deal. We have to buy it. And so he was able to buy it. Now, that doubled the size of the United States at that time. And to explore it, he had to get, let's go back one. So terrain, mountains, ups and downs. He needed to know what he actually bought. Okay, what is the extent of that purchase? What's out there? And so he hired or sent this troop of Lewis and Clark. Meriwether Lewis was 29 years old, and he got 28 guys together to go explore that purchase. Now, in the exploration rules, European exploration rules, okay, you sail into a river, that's your initial claim. The next thing you have to do is you have to explore it, make sure that it's, see what's out there, map it out, and then you have to actually start colonizing it, putting people out there. If you look at the settlement patterns, you do see some settlement patterns that are definitely French down in Mississippi and also in the northern coast of St. Lawrence Seaway. That's southern Canada nowadays. And they do populate the land differently than the English would. And we'll run through that later on. But the French didn't really, well, let's see. Besides getting out of Mississippi or Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, they didn't progress up the Mississippi River very far. They did send out, these people are called voyageurs, trappers, people that go harvest pelts and send them back to Europe for fashion reasons. So they had these fur trappers that did populate quite a bit of the Mississippi River, but they didn't really build very much. These were just individual people out there. They also did the same thing in Canada through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Great Lakes. And that's probably where they had the greater control up there. But when we went out into the American West, okay, we did not really consider Native Americans. So claiming the river, exploration, and then establishing colonies. And that's really where the Americans were pretty good at it, sending people out further west to populate these regions. Now, Lewis and Clark, they took off and they had an extensive exploration of the Mississippi-Missouri River drainage. In fact, they were supposed to find the headwaters of the Missouri River. We are not going to go into all their details, but these guys, their whole troop was phenomenal. From the sailors at this time frame to these explorers, they seem to have superhuman strength and superhuman abilities because Lewis and Clark, they took off from St. Louis. They show little canoes, but they actually had a boat that they would push up the Missouri River all the way into Montana. And once they got to Montana, they were able to make that transition. You can follow that light blue river. Once they got into, that's about Bozeman area, then they transferred across and took horses over the Rocky Mountains. Now, we talked a little bit about geographic theories last week and how European geographers thought that there would be a balanced continent south of Europe, and that happened to be Australia. But they also had this theory that between the east and the west, there'd be a short day hike between the headwaters of the Missouri River and headwaters of the Columbia. Depending on where you end up, that's not quite a short day's hike. The Rocky Mountains are several hundred miles of rugged terrain, and the rivers flow north and south, and very few of them will flow east and west. And so you can see right there in Yellowstone Park, the Snake River starts in Yellowstone Park, and so does the Yellowstone River. One flows toward the Pacific, one flows toward the Caribbean. And so there is a short hike between those two rivers, but what you need to get to put a canoe in and float is a little bit different. Okay. Now, Lewis and Clark did not know that terrain, and so they took up and over um, and ended up with the Nez Perce. And so they actually spent 2 winters on their travel from St. Louis, Missouri to the Oregon coast. And then that last winter on the coast, so they spent a winter with the Mandan up in the Dakotas. Then they spent a winter with the Nez Perce, and they spent a winter out here um, with wait, maybe they didn't spend a winter with their Nez Perce, but they came down and they wintered out here. And I think they did. I have to look this up. Oh my goodness, it's been too long. But then they returned. So it took them 2.5 to 3 years to get out and back. And many of the Americans back east thought that they had died. They'd been wiped out. But they only lost one guy, and he had an appendicitis and probably wouldn't have survived back home either. Um, Now, their trip back east, I think, was just 1 year. They were able to quickly navigate up the Columbia River, cross over to the Missouri, and float down the Missouri in Yellowstone. Um, but they helped solidify our claim, the American claim, to the Pacific Northwest. Um, they also were able to look at some of the markets that we could have out here by looking at the beaver pellets and that sort of thing that the French were already exploiting. Okay, they were up in the Dakotas. They were the voyageurs I was telling you about that were in southern Canada all the way through the Great Lakes. And those guys were superhuman. Talk about superhuman strength. Voyageurs would eat up to 20 pounds of buffalo meat a day, and they could travel about 200 miles a day as well in canoes. And also, another thing that stands out in my head, 200-pound packs. They could carry 200-pound packs, and they didn't have them on their shoulders. They would strap it across their forehead. And these guys were not super big. They were short, stout, great endurance, ate a lot of buffalo meat because they burned a lot of calories. And they were also very regimented. That's how they knew they could travel about 200 miles a day by canoe, because they knew how fast to stroke the canoe and how far they could travel each time. Another thing that Lewis and Clark that's amazing about them is as they mapped this out, they measured how far it was from St. Louis to the Pacific coast, and they weren't very far off. I think under 100 miles, I think it's under 15 or 20 miles. I mean, they were very close to being exact. And how they did it, I've heard theories, but it's amazing. I'm not sure exactly how they did it. Meriwether Lewis, he did suffer from mental illness as well. He was manic depressive, some people think. On his journey out west, he was a very good writer, wrote quite a bit, but he would have these bouts of depression. And I believe once he was on the Pacific coast, he did kind of lament. He cried about how he was not able to accomplish anything in his life. And he's only 30, 31 years old after leading this group of people all the way across the Pacific, or all the way across the North American continent, and before he returned. Now, also in this group, Captain Clark had a slave named York who worked as a free person all the way over. I hate to say free because he was Captain Clark's slave, but on the expedition, he serviced as a expedition member. He had voting rights. He could communicate freely with everyone. And so it's fascinating to see that African Americans in 1803 were given that consideration. And when we look at American history, American slaveholders really started to push theories that African Americans were not human about this time frame. So up until that time frame, slavery may not have had that same racial element or racial superiority. Yes, it did. It's very complicated when we look at it. Hopefully, guys, when we look at American history, we can delve into that a little bit more. Another person that was important on this journey, Sacagawea. Okay, she was a slave as well. She came from southern Montana, northern Idaho, and she was captured in the war, sold across, and eventually a French Canadian fur trapper named Charbonneau either won her or bought her in a gambling, and she was his wife. And she served as a translator because Lewis and Clark met Charbonneau and Sacagawea in the Mandan villages in Dakota and used her to communicate with other people as they traveled west. And there is some fascinating stories there as well. On the coast, Fort Clatsop, rain all the time. Native Americans kind of gave them a broad, didn't come visit them very much. They knew there were a lot of natives in that western region, but the natives just gave them a lot of space and didn't come visit them very much. But they did have a few contacts with the American natives out there. They were hoping to catch a ship on the Pacific coast, but the year that they were there, or those months they were there on the Columbia, no ships passed by. In maritime law, a lot of times, if you guys have ever heard of, oh great, what's the name? Robinson Crusoe. That's it. Robinson Crusoe was shipwrecked on an island in the South Pacific. And back then, if you were not getting along with your crew members, you could, if you were an officer, you could request to be marooned, and they would set you ashore with a few supplies. And the hope would be that you would catch a new ship and be able to join them on a return voyage. Robinson Crusoe spent, I think, 5 years out there by himself, living on goats. And that's another thing that these ships do is they drop off animals like goats to live on the island that they could hunt later on. But Lewis and Clark hoped to see a ship come by so they could put things on that ship to send back to the west or the east coast. No ship ever came by that they ever saw. And so it was kind of a very chancy or risky expedition, both at sea and by land. And like I said, they did have some contact with the Native American cultures out here, but it wasn't super extensive because, like I said, the natives kind of gave them a wide berth, didn't invade their territory very much. They were able to bring back some specimens all the way across the United States. They would kill and take these specimens back. When they hit the Rocky Mountains, they talked about this bear, a grizzly bear that wouldn't be killed very easily. And some of the men that were on the expedition, actually on the return home, decided to stay out west. And so they didn't follow their Lewis and Clark all the way back home, but stayed in Montana to trap and make their own living. John Coulter. I got to tell you about John Coulter. We'll do that next time. Because Coulter's hell. Great story there. Okay. If you have any questions, let me know. And I do have a little work for you.